For 2 decades, my dad made a living as an offshore fishing guide, taking people on daily fishing trips out of Bridge Harbor in Freeport, Texas. This lifestyle was made possible for my dad due to the existence of one species of fish in particular, the red snapper. The red snapper is the bread and butter catch of any fishing trip. They're fun to catch, they're plentiful, and they're a delight when they're on your dinner plate. But despite this, and despite the populations of red snapper being higher than they've been in many decades, the opportunities presented to anglers to catch these fish in the recent years have been slim. And anglers and guides, such as my dad, have suffered because of this. Today, I'll talk about the conservation efforts through the state of Texas to help the snapper population rebound from what it once was. I'll talk about the current state of the snapper population in the Gulf of Mexico, off the Texas coast in particular. And I'll talk about how strict fishing laws and limits negatively affects anglers off the coast of Texas. The main source I'll be using today is fisheries.noaa.gov. I'll also be using articles from the Houston Chronicle, Miami Herald, and Corpus Christi Caller-Times. So, why are there so little opportunities to catch red snapper in recent days? It's because of the conservation efforts. Because snapper weren't always as plentiful as they are today. From the 1980s all the way up until the late 2000s, snapper populations actually dwindled. So a conservation push was needed and it was received. In the year 2000, the snapper season was reduced from year-round to 194 days. But this still wasn't enough. Snapper populations continued to dwindle. So in 2008, the state of Texas made a drastic change. The season was reduced from 194 days to just 65 days. And the limit of fish per person that you could keep per trip was reduced from 4 fish to only 2 fish. This was more than enough to help snapper populations rebound, but the state of Texas didn't stop there. The seasons kept on getting shorter and shorter in recent years. In the year 2011, the season was reduced from 65 to 48 days. And in the year 2014, it reached its all-time low of just a 9-day red snapper fishing season. This means that if an angler went out and snapper fished every day of the season and caught his limit of 2 fish, he'd only catch 18 fish over the whole year, which isn't enough, and it's certainly not enough for a fishing guide such as my dad to make a living, which is one of the main reasons he is no longer a fishing guide today. Conservation work though. The snapper population's rebounded, and there are more snapper in the Gulf of Mexico today than there have been in a very long time, but there is such thing as too much of a good thing. The snapper population's absolutely exploded. There are more snapper in the Gulf of Mexico today than there have been in more than half a century, and they're big snapper too, which is significant. Because as female snapper get larger, their ability to produce eggs goes up exponentially, which means an even bigger explosion in population, according to fisheries.noaa.gov. It's to the point now that they're out competing other fish, like triggerfish. Triggerfish used to be a common catch in the standard day of fishing for Texas. If you didn't come home from a trip with at least one triggerfish in the icebox, it was a rarity. But now, in the last 10 trips I've been on, there hasn't been a single triggerfish caught. This is because red snapper, especially large red snapper, like to snack on juvenile triggerfish. And it's to the point now where triggerfish, a species which once thrives, their numbers now dwindle in the Gulf of Mexico because of the overpopulation of snapper. And they're not the only species of fish that is suffering from this overpopulation. Red snapper are also taking over fishing spots. Any rig, any reef, any wreck, any structure that would serve as a home to multiple species of fish is now overrun by snapper, which puts recreational fishermen in quite a pickle. Because even if a fisherman cannot legally keep any more snapper, assuming that fisherman is still fishing for other species, catching more snapper is almost inevitable. See, the average fishing day for a Texas fisherman is you go to your first spot, you catch your limit of snapper like that, and then you go and fish for other species. But once you've caught your limit of snapper, or it's not during the snapper season, and you drop a sardine down expecting to catch a grouper or an amberjack or a cobia or some other species of fish that you would have been able to easily catch 10 to 15 years ago, you most likely won't be able to catch that fish today because a snapper will get your bait before anything else does. Now, this wouldn't be anything more than a big annoyance if snapper didn't have such a negative reaction to sudden pressure changes. By the time the snapper gets to the boat, it's probably going to look like this. The excess pressure in its body tries to force its way out. Sometimes its eyes will be bulging out of its head and its gallbladder will be expanded from its body, and snapper do not recover from this condition. So even though you're catching snapper and they're dying as you're catching them, you're not allowed to keep them. So you have to throw the carcasses back out in the water where they become shark food instead of human food, wasted. And there's also the problem of you not being able to catch other fish. If you look at a fishing picture from 10 to 15 years ago, there's likely to be a big variety. Snapper, kingfish, mahi-mahi, cobia, grouper, wahoo, among other species. But now, it's a rarity to catch anything other than red snapper or kingfish, which is quite sad. It takes away a lot of the variety and a lot of the fun out of recreational fishing in Texas. So the conservation was effective, but it was too effective, and it continues to be too effective to this day. The snapper season in 2020 lasted 65 days, which is a big improvement over the 9 days it lasted in 2014, but it's still not enough. Snapper populations are still continuing to skyrocket, and the ecosystems of the Gulf of Mexico are still continuing to be thrown even more out of whack through the overpopulation of these fish. So, today I talked about the conservation efforts of the state of Texas to help the snapper population rebound. I talked about how there are more snapper in the Gulf of Mexico today than there have been in quite a long time, to the point where it's a problem now. And I've talked about the fact that even though red snapper are commonly the only fish an angler will be able to catch offshore now, they're still not allowed to keep them, which has a very large negative impact on recreational fishing off the Texas coast. And to paint a better picture of what's going on at a reef or a wreck on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, I'll leave you with a quote today from Bob Spaeth, an executive director of the Southern Offshore Fishing Association. My theory is there's a piece of the bottom, a coral reef or whatever, and there's only so much, and it has a carrying capacity, like so many rooms in a hotel. And it looks like the red snapper are parked in the hotel and none of the other fish can get in. Thank you for your time.